pleased to welcome back to the program Senator Marco Rubio of Florida. Senator, great to talk to you again. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Hey, thanks for having me back.
My pleasure. I want to start. You've got an op-ed at foxnews.com today. You write, Warren's economic patriotism plan simply not possible with a progressive agenda. This coming on the heels of what you've put out. You're calling it an investment report. What's your argument?
Well, my argument is, I actually give her credit. She's the first Democrat to kind of lay out the argument that American economic policy should put American workers and American businesses first. I think where she's going to have big troubles is that what it's going to take to actually do that is going to run smack into the demands of the progressive radical progressives that dominate the party she's trying to become the nominee of. They demand cultural warfare. They demand the demonization of corporations writ large. They demand, all sorts of things that, putting the sort of the things that matter to upper middle class people living in the coastal areas of the country and in the pockets of prosperity. They demand that those things be put in front of the sort of hard choices that need to be made to reorient our policy. And frankly, if she decides that she wants to have a policy that achieves what she's talking about, she's not going to have a home in the Democratic Party. I mean, that's not what they want from their nominee.
What are those hard choices that need to be made in terms of reorienting policy?
Well, I think at first it begins by recognizing that you can't have a healthy economy with high-paying jobs without companies and corporations that are doing well. And look, I've beat up on big corporations because I don't always believe that they have. In fact, I don't think they have American interests at heart most of the time. I was reading an article yesterday about these big companies are leading boycotts and all sorts of social activism. These are the same companies who, on the other hand, ask us not to sanctions on China, or they want us to lift sanctions on Russia, or they want us to get back into the JCPOA so they can do business in Iran. So they seem to be very tolerant of dictators and authoritarians all over the world, but are prepared to boycott states because they don't like some law passed by the democratically elected legislature of that state. So, I beat them up pretty good. On the same token, we do need big business in America. We also need a lot of small businesses. I mean, you need them both. And some of the key things we need success for in our country cannot be achieved if we have a climate that's negative to these companies. The other choices that have to be made, frankly, would require us to take on some of the orthodoxy in the Republican Party. And that includes this notion that everything, we've become a party almost dominated by the needs of the financial markets. The financial markets, the stock market, Wall Street, investor class, they're an important part of the economy, but they are not the economy. And so what you end up happening is you have corporations today who basically feel like their number one objective is to return value to shareholders, and as a result, many are committing corporate suicide in the long term. They're not investing, and that has an economic implication for this country. More and more of this investment deteriorates, the likelier it is that the great innovations, the great companies, the great industries of the 21st century are going to be located somewhere else, but not in America and not for Americans.
If listeners want to read more, they can go to foxnews.com and take a look at what Senator Rubio wrote today in his column. I want to go overseas, Senator, and talk about the latest coming out of Venezuela. It's, of course, a topic that you've been covering extremely closely. It's very personal to you. The Russians, it seems, have pulled out, or at least have stopped some of their efforts to prop up the Maduro regime. What's the very latest in Venezuela? Are there new glimmers of hope for people who support the opposition, which the U.S. government, I think, has rightly identified and recognized as the legitimate interim government?
Yeah, I don't think the Russians have any loyalty or affinity to Maduro as an individual. I think two things. Number one is they find this as an opportunity to play spoiler, to basically undermine an American foreign policy priority. And number two, to project power internationally, to show people, hey, we're Russia, we can even play in the Western Hemisphere. And Putin has sort of perfected the art of being able to have high-yield, low-cost engagements in places like Syria to some extent, but most certainly in Ukraine and here in Venezuela, to sort of put out this message that helps them domestically, too, that, hey, Russia's a great power again, on par with the United States. And so I think that's what their interest is there. As far as Maduro is concerned, here's the bottom line, okay? All this talk about how Maduro's in power. Maduro doesn't control Venezuela. He doesn't govern Venezuela. He has control over its repressive apparatus. I can assure you of this. This I can tell you with 100% certainty. Every single key individual in his regime around him knows that he is going to fall and that he needs to go. What is happening now is both open and secret jockeying to be the person that succeeds him. And that's the problem. The problem is not getting rid of Maduro. The problem is whether he's replaced by a democracy or by someone else under the same system, maybe a little bit less anti-American, at least openly, but not a democracy. That's the bigger challenge here.
Why do you think, just going back to the Russia point, because there were these reports that some of their assets were being pulled back, why do you think they did that? Was that some sort of concession to us, or what changed?
No. Yeah, I think what changed is twofold. Number one, they're not getting paid. I mean, the Maduro regime doesn't pay its bills. They just defaulted again this week on another loan and lost 20 tons of gold, which they had used as collateral. So that's the first. The second, I think the Russians don't have any respect for them. They find him to be incompetent. They find him to be corrupt. And for the Russians to say he's corrupt just tells you the level of corruption we're talking about.
Bad.
And the third is, some of these are private companies that were sent in to do work on a project. Hey, can you get this radar site to work again? So they went in, they got it up and operative, and now the work is done. And now they got to figure out how to leave, and without appearing to be abandoning the guy. So that's part of this as well. But look, the Russian effort there, they fully recognize who Maduro is. They would cut him loose tomorrow if they felt there was an opportunity to replace him with somebody who was not pro-American and could allow them to say that they thwarted an American priority. And that's what's happening right now. I mean, that's what they and others are actively engaged in, is sort of figuring out who to replace Maduro with. They'll find somebody out there, one of these governors from the Chavista party who is less moderate or somehow, but it'll be a figurehead, it'll be a puppet, and the real power will remain in the hands of the corrupt people. This is not a government. The Maduro regime is an organized crime ring. And the reason why they're fighting to stay in power is not ideology. It's because they have made millions and millions of dollars from corruption, graft, and theft, and they don't want to lose that. And they most certainly don't want to go to jail for it.
Senator, on another international matter, you've been talking a lot, writing a lot about China as an adversary across the globe. Senator Romney just gave his maiden floor speech. A lot of it focused on China as well. What do you see as the important dynamics of the U.S.-China relationship that you think Americans need to know about? And as the president and his team are trying to hammer out some sort of a deal, a better deal with the Chinese, what would a better deal in your mind look like? What must it entail?
Balance, both geopolitical, economic, and otherwise, the military. There has to be balance and some level of symmetry. And that's not where we're headed right now. We have treated China as a poor developing country and allowed them to cheat and steal for a long time under the assumption that once they got rich, they would become like us. We finally figured out, it took too long, that wasn't the case. And now we're trying to make up for lost ground. And right now we're headed to a very imbalanced relationship where more and more of the high end of the economy is headed in their direction and away from us. And because they've stolen the technology, or frankly, because they've put our companies or Western companies out of business through unfair practices. So the first begins with balance. The second is alliances. The one thing China's not good at is alliances. And so one of the things that balances out the world is strong alliances with our European allies, strong alliances with India and Australia and Japan and the Asia-Pacific region. And what these alliances mean is, this notion that America dominated the world is not true. We're the most powerful country in the world. But for much of the period after the Second World War, that was balanced by the Soviet bloc. What allowed the Cold War to go in our direction was that we had very strong alliances with the free world, and that ultimately communism collapsed. If more of those countries had fallen into the Soviet orb, history might have been very different. And so I think it's a combination. And then, of course, the strong domestic capacity. If we lose, the great industries of the 21st century are not located in the West, and particularly in the United States. They're located in China. They will get to set the terms for what the 21st century looks like. And it's not going to be a democratic one. It's not going to be a one that respects the individual rights and freedoms and liberties. That's what will happen if the most powerful country in the world is a totalitarian regime like the Chinese regime.
Senator Rubio, you mentioned alliances there. One of our allies, and certainly a top trading partner, is Mexico. A number of your Republican colleagues have come out against the president's gambit here on tariffs and tying that to immigration policy. You have come out seemingly kind of reluctantly in favor of what the president's doing. Are you concerned at all about endorsing a precedent of a United States president using punitive tariffs and effective tax increases on Americans to try to achieve sort of a separate foreign policy or domestic policy outcome?
Yeah, look, I prefer that wouldn't have happened because I'm not a person. By writ large, I'm not a tariff fan. I think you try to avoid them. I don't like them as a matter of policy. I do think sometimes they're necessary, either in order to protect yourself or, in this case, as a matter of leverage. And if there is a better way to get Mexico to do things that are not unreasonable, like number one, can you monitor, they have a much narrower border than we do. Can you monitor what's inside the trucks and rail cars headed north? Number, can you build some physical structures to make it harder for people to cross over from the Guatemalan border? Will you act on, when we give you actionable intelligence that says, here's what the trafficking network is going to do tomorrow, can you stop them and arrest them? Will you actually go and do it? I don't know how else to get them to do it. I mean, we've tried every carrot that we have to get them to do that, and it hasn't happened. And so the president says, this is the one I've got. I've got to use this stick. It's the only one I have that actually works. And if someone has a better one, I'm for it. No one's come up with a better one that gets them to the table, and at least they're at the table now. But, it's frustrating to read just yesterday, 1,000 migrants. I mean, AP, the Associated Press, had a reporter there, saw 1,000 migrants come across the border, headed towards the United States, escorted along the way, and facilitated by Mexican state and local police officers. I mean, they are, they're encouraging this when they do that, and we're paying a tremendous price here domestically, having to reassign federal agents away from other critical obligations to have to continue to reinforce the border to deal with this humanitarian crisis down there.
Last question, Senator Rubio. It's on American politics, some of the domestic fighting that goes on here. Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, now widely reported, according to many sources, last night during a closed-door meeting of top Democrats, they were arguing about impeachment, and she reportedly told Jerry Nadler, speaking of the president, quote, I don't want to see him impeached. I want to see him in prison. I wonder what you make of that comment from the Speaker.
Well, again, I didn't hear her say it, but I'm going to assume it's accurate. I don't think she's denied saying that. I think two things are happening. The first is you can see the pressure she's under for impeachment. I mean, there are people in Congress who spend 90% of their time figuring out how can we get rid of the president, and not figuring out, how we can move the country forward, not figuring out how can we win the election in 8/20. They spend their whole time with this notion of how can we get him removed from office, and it's an unhealthy obsession. And obviously she's got a lot of pressure on her, and she needs to sort of nod in their direction. This is what I mean by a Democrat. This is what I meant when we started out this interview about radical progressives who they're demanding these cultural fights. They're demanding these sorts of things. They're not demanding a certain public policy to grow our economy or take on China. They are demanding this. This is what they spend 90% of their time on. That's what I make of it. And so I imagine that's her best effort to sort of appease them. But it's obviously, it's troubling because this, she controls the House of Representatives, but I think it's pretty clear what direction they're headed here, and that is they're not trying to offer counter policies. They're looking to destroy the President of the United States. If they want, I understand they don't agree with his policies. That's why we have elections every 4 years.
Senator Marco Rubio of Florida, so appreciate your time. Look forward to having you back. Really appreciate it.
Okay, thanks for having me.